Hello, everyone. Who likes trains? Who likes tunnels? You've come to the right place. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and thank you all for being here tonight for our first Wednesday presentation. I'm actually sort of surprised to see so many of you today. First of all, I have to say thanks to the library, as always, the Mill Valley Historical Society, of which I'm on the board of directors in charge of the oral history program and co-in charge of the first Wednesday speaker series. We are so grateful to use the library as our space for the presentations. So first and foremost, let us say thanks to the Mill Valley Library. One of the ways we like to show our gratitude for the use of this space is after the presentation to help stack the chairs, put them back on the racks, and return the furniture that's been moved aside back to its original position. So anybody that cares to help with that, we are most appreciative. Also, who's a member of the Mill Valley Historical Society here? Well, thank you for your membership. And for all of those who aren't members, I urge you to consider a membership is so affordable in these days, and you'll get all kinds of wonderful perks and the emails that remind you to come to these talks and our annual walk and all the things that we come up with to help you enjoy your town just a little bit more, to make your experience here a little bit richer, and to be out in the world with the people that have like interests to yours. Here's a little bit about the timing for this evening. As usual, the presentations run about 50 minutes, and afterwards we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A. So I ask that everyone hold their questions for these presentations to that Q&A, and then after the Q&A, we'll have our time to say hello to friends and talk with each other, share stories, and ask our presenter any questions you may have about that may not have been answered during the Q&A. Well, tonight we are very fortunate to have one of Mill Valley Historical Society's favorite speakers. How favorite is he? Well, we like him a lot. He has presented at least 6 times, well, you could say 6.5 times here in the past. 3 of the talks were about the railroad. 1 was about the 1906 earthquake. 1 presentation was about the town of Ross. Another presentation was about the town of Kentfield. And one of the presentations was abruptly halted midway when somebody fainted, and then he came back and did it again. And so that's almost really 7. So today would be his 8th. And he'll probably come many, many times again in the future. In addition to being a very wonderful speaker, and have I even said his name? Shall we say his name? Say, welcome, Richard Torney. Richard Torney is a historian for the Jose Maria del Pino Library and Ross Historical Society. He's on the board of the Kentfield Greenbrae Historical Society. He's the program coordinator for the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Historical Society and helps organize their quarterly programs at the Elks Club in San Rafael. And if any of you are interested in what they call, I believe, train porn, is that what it is? That's actually what they call it. Information, all the stuff about trains. You may want to attend their meeting in October. And you can talk to Richard after this presentation to learn more about why that's going to be such a great meeting. And if that's not enough, Richard is also a docent for the Tamalpais Gravity Car Barn. So he's like a full-on major historian, isn't he? And with a lot of energy, too. Richard, you know, I'm a historian, too, and a naturalist, and I enjoy researching anything to do with Mount Tam. And recently I came up with a little information about you in the mountain. You know, most people know that Richard is 4th generation Californian, and he's a lifelong Marinite, and that his parents were here in Mill Valley but he wasn't born here. He was born in San Francisco. But what I happened to uncover was another bit of data, and that is at a very, and I want you to validate this just in case, because we historians want proof, that at a very formative time in your life, you lived inside a cabin in Muir Woods. Is that true?
That is correct.
Yeah, so maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my father was a general contractor. He built a number of homes here in Mill Valley.
And I'm fairly deaf, so if I can hear, everybody can hear.
They're controlling it in the back there. Can you hear that?
I'm hearing you at the moment, yes.
Yeah, okay, well, they're running the mic in the back there. So anyway, my father was a general contractor, and he was building the house that my parents were living in while my mother was pregnant with me. And housing was difficult. This is 1948. That'll give you a clue how long ago it was. They rented one of the cabins in the Muir Woods Inn. So my mother was living in Muir Woods, and I was inside, so I was living in Muir Woods.
New history comes forward every day. Well, do you remember the address of your parents' house in Mill Valley?
Well, when I was a kid, my mom said if you ever get lost, go up to an adult, tell them your name, tell them where you live, 91 Woodbine Drive, and your phone number, Dunlop 81957.
He really is a historian.
I didn't know how to use a telephone, but I knew the number.
Please welcome tonight Richard Torney.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deborah. Well, a little background about this program. As Deborah mentioned, I'm the program coordinator for the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Historical Society's quarterly programs, so I'm always looking for guest speakers. And a number of years ago, I approached some of the board members and said, hey, has anybody ever done a program about the tunnels on the Northwestern Pacific Railroad? And they said, that sounds like a great idea. Go ahead. So I got started on it, and I got a lot of help from a number of people and many resources, and have done several versions of this program with the help of Fred Cadoni and Gus Campagna, who are both very active with the Historical Society. So these are some of the people that provided information, and I always like to start these programs by asking the audience, how many railroad tunnels were built in Marin County? Now, you don't have to answer, because I'm going to tell you in just a second. But many people are surprised. So this is the list that I started with. So up on the top here, this is the main line from Tiburon to Eureka, and there are 40 tunnels. Now only the first 4 are in Marin County, so there's 4 tunnels. Now down on the bottom is the narrow gauge main line from Sausalito to Cazadero, and there are 7 tunnels there. Only 6 of them are in Marin, so there are 10 railroad tunnels in Marin County. Now, in working on this program, I said, how are you going to do a program about 47 tunnels? Because, there's a lot of work involved in doing it, but what's a tunnel? It's a hole in the ground with railroad tracks going into it, and you can take a picture from the outside, or you can take a picture from the inside. And yeah, there's a lot of tunnels with really remarkable scenery. And this one here, at Island Mountain, look at that high bridge going into a tunnel on a cliff the tunnel was over 4,000 feet long, a really remarkable engineering feat. And by the way, there was a flood in this canyon in the mid-1960s, and that tunnel was underwater. And here's a tunnel that runs underneath a cemetery. So lots of interesting stories, but 47 tunnels is too many, so I'm going to focus on the 10 in Marin County. Now, just to get an understanding, you need some railroad parlance. When these railroads were built, for some reason, all railroads had a western terminus and an eastern terminus. Now, both of these railroads ran north to south, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just where the rules were. So the western terminus for the narrow gauge was Sausalito, and the western terminus for the the standard gauge was Tiburon. Tiburon going towards Eureka, roughly the 101 corridor, Sausalito going up to Cazadero and the Russian River, roughly the Highway 1 coastal route. So the tunnels are numbered in the sequence from the western terminal heading east. So the first tunnel you come to is tunnel number 1. And the portal of that tunnel will be the western portal. The other outside is the eastern portal. It has nothing to do with what direction the tunnel is facing. It's its orientation to the western and eastern terminus. Now, we're going to start with the narrow gauge because those are the ones that built the tunnels first. And the numbering gets pretty confusing, but you'll understand it by the time you get to the end. Now, this is a painting that was done around 1890, and it shows two things. Here is the original route of the narrow gauge. It went from Pine Point in Sausalito, which is about where the Bay model is, across the Strawberry Point. And from there, the tracks ran along Lyford Cove, climbed over the ridge, and came down into Corte Madera. Now, that was a lot of expense to maintain the trestle and the drawbridge, and a lot of hard work on the equipment, climbing and a lot of curves. And there was very little in the way of revenue production on that route. So in 1886, they built this second route, which is the one which is today's bike path. It goes by Mill Valley. It's relatively level. The curves are gentle. The Mill Valley branch was a great revenue producer for the railroads, and that's where the tunnel was from Mill Valley through to Corte Madera. But since they started with this earlier route, they ran through Ross Valley, and when they got past Fairfax, they came to White's Hill, and they had to build a tunnel there. They had to build two tunnels. So the first tunnel was tunnel number 1 in the beginning. That's going to change. It's a short tunnel, only 370 feet long, built in 1874. I haven't been able to find any photographs of that tunnel with the railroad tracks still in place, but this was taken in the mid-60s where the portal, this is the west portal, is still generally standing. If you go up there, it's up behind White's Hill School. It's pretty much caved in. Some of the timbers are still there. I've never been able to find anything on the east portal. So the next tunnel was tunnel number 2 for a while, and that was the narrow gauge, a longer tunnel further up the hill. Now, that was a torturous route as well. This huge trestle was only part of the work that was required to get far enough up the hill to go through the tunnel. And things didn't always work smoothly on this line. Here you see railroad cars ready to go down the hill. So the story is this was a Sunday excursion train filled with passengers, and as the train climbed up White's Hill, there were some stunning views down the valley, and apparently too many passengers went over to the that side. And it just laid over. Well, the newspaper article said that there was no serious injuries and everybody was able to get off safely, and they sent special trains in from both ends so people could go home or continue their journey. And then the following day, the workmen were able to attach cables to the cars, and they pulled it back up on the track, and all was fixed. So this is the only photograph I've been able to find of this tunnel number 2, and it's, of course, long after the tracks have been removed. I did learn that after the railroad stopped using this tunnel, some farmers leased the tunnel and had a mushroom farm on the inside. I don't know how long that lasted, but White's Hill has always been unstable. There have been many reports of the road washing out, and of course where this tunnel is has completely caved in. And Brian Sagar with the Fairfax Historical Society has helped me with this identification. This is the top of White's Hill, and you can see that that's that new bridge they built near the top that the graffiti people have certainly found. Yeah, so there's the cut where Sir Francis Drake goes through. So Brian, with GPS and old maps and stuff, has determined that that's about where the western portal was. Now, the eastern portal is completely covered by what is now Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. Though when you get down to the bottom of the hill, you can see where the railroad grade crossed, and then off to your right, as you're going towards San Geronimo, you can still see the old narrow gauge railroad grade running behind the pasture. So that's those two tunnels. Now we're going to go out to West Marin, and there were two tunnels, one at Camp Pistolesi and the other one at Tomales. And they numbered 3 and 4 in the beginning. So here's number 3, short tunnel, built in 1874. And when the railroad got to Tomales, it was really a big deal. I mean, the people had been really kind of isolated out there. If they wanted to go to the city or into town, it was a long journey on horseback or a wagon or get on a boat. With the railroad there, they had easy transportation for people and for freight and for produce. It was really a big deal. Looks like here a family outing is let's go down to the tunnel and have our picture taken. So it was a big deal. This was a newspaper article describing an accident that happened at that tunnel. There was a work train going to do some repairs north of Tomales, and it had a steam shovel followed by a couple of flat cars, and the workmen along were riding on the flat cars behind the steam shovel. Well, when the steam shovel got to the tunnel, it hit the timbers and knocked them down, and the rocks on the top came down onto the flat car. And one man was killed outright, and a number of them were seriously injured. Now here's a later photograph of that same tunnel after the tracks have been removed. And here's 1952, the same location. And now this is, Walter Selmer is the sheriff that's in there, and the other one is a Marin County official. In the early part of the Cold War, there was some consideration of using some of the abandoned railroad tunnels in Marin to safely store county records. Well, it didn't work out. Tunnels are too wet, so they never did. But they looked into it. And here we are, 1968, same spot. And this is a Google view. So here's the railroad grade, and there's the west portal, and there's the east portal. And the train continues towards Tomales. There's today's Shoreline Highway. Now, I was there a couple of years ago and took these photographs, and you can still see through the tunnel. Some of the timbers are there, but everything's kind of just laid down on the ground. Here's looking from east portal back towards west. So most of the wood is down. There's a number of rocks that have fallen through, but you can still walk through it. Now, here's Tomales Tunnel number 4, built in 1875. And who would let their kids do that now? And notice it's number 4 in this photograph. And that was a relatively straight tunnel. You can see the light at the other end there. And this is from the Parks family. The Parks family ranch owns the land where this tunnel portal is. Actually, the tunnel right-of-way right now, I think there are 4 different owners, 2 at each end and then 2 in the middle. Here's the Tomales special coming out of the tunnel. This is the western portal as the train is heading towards Sausalito. And they sent this picture also of the Tomales special. Now here's another cave-in on that tunnel that was going to take a couple of days to repair, so everybody else had to go roundabout to get to where we usually would go by train. Now just beyond Tomales was Fallons Creamery. This has nothing to do with tunnels, but it's right in the neighborhood. Now this one here, notice it says North Shore Railroad. So this photograph would have been taken between 1902 and 1907. Because after that, the North Shore became the Northwestern Pacific Railroad. Now here is a photograph of the Fallons Creamery. It wasn't really a train station, but there was a warehouse that passengers waiting for the train were welcome to go in and wait, and there was always a barrel of buttermilk there and a cup, and people were welcome to help themselves to it. So this train here would have left Cazadero in the morning. It's on its way to Sausalito. And look on the loading platform, this big white thing you see is a 450-pound piece of cheese that they made, and this was specifically for the 1894 Midwinter Festival that was in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. So this cheese went down to the park and to show what kind of stuff came from West Marin, and then after it had been inspected and looked at, it was cut open, everybody got to eat a piece of cheese. Now this photograph, again, just beyond the tunnel, it comes from the Roy Graves collection. Now Roy Graves had worked for the North Pacific Coast Railroad. He was a very talented photographer, and also he was a great collector. He collected tens of thousands of photographs, Marin County, West Coast, California, a lot of photographs. And of his entire collection, this was one of his absolute favorites. He took this photograph in 1928, and it's described as the southbound train, so that would have left Cazadero. It's on its way to Sausalito, and it just stopped to take on some water and to continue its way south, and it's crossing the state highway. And in the background, you can see this trestle, and I've heard it described as wind bridge or windy bridge. I guess it was windy there all the time, but one of his favorite photographs. So I went out and tried to find pretty much the same spot. Some places the railroad right-of-way is very evident, other places it's completely obliterated, which is the case right here where it crosses. This is Highway 1, just north of Tomales. Now this next photograph, this was from Fred Runner, who among his interests in railroads also volunteers for the Collings Foundation, which maintains a fleet of airworthy World War II aircraft, and that is a rudder on the back of a B24 Bomber. So Fred took this picture out one of the gunner's ports, and we're looking down on that same location. So here's Highway 1, and you can see where the railroad crossed, so that's right where that locomotive was as it was heading. Here's the gorge, or the little valley where the windy trestle was, and you can see the cuts and the tracks there, and it went into this gorge here, and that's where the east portal of the tunnel was, and it came out on the other side near Tamales. Now the west portal is on private property, no trespassing, and it was sealed up, but not completely. And I have some photographs that have come from an anonymous source who says if you're skinny enough, you can get in there. So some of the timbers at the west end are still relatively intact. They're beautiful old growth redwood timbers. But the further you go into the tunnel, the fewer they are, and there's a lot of water in the tunnel, especially as you get towards the other end. It's dry at the west end, not at all at the east end. And you can see here many of the timbers have just collapsed onto the floor, and a lot of stuff has fallen out of the ceiling as well. And there's kind of its own weather pattern in there. You have the cold air in the tunnel and the warm air from the outside. And there is a slight breeze that goes through there because there's a small opening at one end and the other end is wide open. And this is the eastern portal. You need boots up to your knees or better. So that's that tunnel. Now, there was one more tunnel on this run in Sonoma. It was between Tyrone and Camp Meeker. I've got a couple of slides here, 1876. And it shows you the difficult conditions they were working in to get this tunnel built. And that tunnel is entirely on private property now, and I've never tried to get to it, but I've been told that both portals are completely buried. But a number of years ago, there was a cave-in, and if you had the right equipment, you could lower yourself down into the tunnel. So now we go to the Alto Tunnel. This is the one along the line that created the Mill Valley branch. So it becomes tunnel number 1. It's the first one you come to. So the ones on White Hill get bumped up to 2 and 3, and so down the line. So that's why there's a change, and we're not done. It's going to happen again. So there are lots of pictures of this tunnel, and actually I put all the ones I have in my slideshow in it because we're in Mill Valley. So this is the western portal, and I've tried to get in there to take pictures of it now, and it's so overgrown and poison oak, and there wouldn't be room to take a picture even if you got to it. So I have a number of pictures. This is all west portal. And I like this picture. There's Camino Alto, which up till about the late 1920s, that was Highway 101. You're going north and south through Marin, that's the route you went. The route that we're familiar with now was done in several pieces and parts, and it wasn't until, I think, 1931 that Richardson Bay Bridge connected to San Rafael on the route that we use today. And look at those hills in the background, nothing but cows. Now, when this tunnel was built, it was only being used by narrow gauge steam engines, though the tunnel was built to standard gauge specifications, which proved to be a good choice because the electric cars are all standard gauge. and it was a tight fit. Now, I put this picture in. This is the 5-car school special. It's in Kentfield in this photograph. So every morning in Manor and Fairfax, a 5-car train was loaded with high school kids and took them down to Tam High School. At the end of the day, another one came back. And there's just so many great stories. My favorite one being told by Gene Ardito, who was a student at Tam High School. And actually, he's in his 90s, still lives in Fairfax. And one day on the way home, he opened up one of the windows on the train and got out his baseball bat, and he knocked out all the light bulbs going through the tunnel. So when he got to the Corte Madera side, he wasn't sure what to do, so he threw his bat into the bushes so there wouldn't be any evidence. Well, the next morning he went to school, he was called into the principal's office, and there was the railroad policeman, and there was his baseball bat. I asked him what his punishment was. He said he didn't remember it anyway. He did mention, though, that they knew it was his bat, because he was a pretty good baseball player, and he had his nickname on it. Said he was the Dago Slugger. So and there's more great stories too. So here we are, 1957. So the electric trains have been gone since 1941, but they're still running freight. And there was a trailer park in Alto Bowl. So this is World War II. These were emergency housing for Marin ship workers. So there's the railroad tracks right there. And there's the school. I can't think of the name of it. Alto, yeah. And there is talk about reopening that tunnel as a bicycle and pedestrian path. I just was talking to Lee, and they've been doing research on the condition of the tunnel and finding out about what's going to be required to get access on the right-of-ways, and all things are looking pretty good. So keep your fingers crossed, and maybe we'll be riding through there. So here's a view out of the tunnel. This is on the Corte Madera side, the east portal, looking towards Chapman, the Chapman stop. And here we're looking back at the tunnel, the east portal. And this was when they were running narrow gauge trains on these 3-foot space tracks, standard gauge steam engines and electric engines on the outer tracks, and there's the third rail that powered. So there's 4 rails in each direction. But this was the only section of the electrified system that was never double tracked. So they always had to narrow down to one tunnel, a single track to get through the tunnel. And here are some repairs, improvements being done in 1958, and somebody built a house above the tunnel. I don't know if I'd do that. And here's some traffic. The last train carrying revenue-producing freight out of Sausalito was in 1971. Now, there were some work trains after that, but not long after the route was completely abandoned. And here they are sealing the tunnel. Now, last time I did this program here in Mill Valley, there was somebody in the audience who stood up afterwards and said that the west portal on the Mill Valley side had been plugged with pea gravel, and that the eastern portal on the Corte Madera side had been filled with concrete because there was a house above it, but it was intentionally weak concrete. I think he said 1 or 2 sack mix. So not something you would use for a foundation on your house, but enough that it's concrete. So if they're going to reopen the tunnel, it's not going to be as difficult as it might to get that concrete out of there. And it's been sealed off with a bunch of ends of boxcars that have been welded together that every few years the kids pry it open and they get in there and find the concrete, so there isn't anywhere to go. So the last tunnel is the Bothene Tunnel, built in 1904. When the electric rails were put in 1902, there was consideration of running the electric system out to Point Reyes Station. Well, there's no way the electric trains could have gone over the narrow gauge route through the 2 tunnels. So they did a standard gauge tunnel called the Bothene Tunnel. And this shows the rail line through Fairfax and Fairfax Manor, and there's the short tunnel and winding up the hill, and there's the tunnel, second tunnel, and back down to San Geronimo. So here is the standard gauge route from Bothene, and there's the longer tunnel coming through at Woodacre. Now, this here, you notice that the north arrow is pointing off to the left, so I flipped it so it's pointing up and down. And I ran into a number of problems with photographs because here you see all three of these tunnels. This end of the tunnel is facing east, but that's the west portal. So people who would say, oh, that's the west end of the tunnel. Well, yeah, it's the west end of the tunnel, but it's the east portal. Yeah, so anyway, I figured it out. So now this is an interesting photograph. We're looking at one of the trestles that was built for the standard gauge to the Bothene Tunnel. But here you can see the original narrow gauge route, and this was the little ridge that the short tunnel went through, and then it continued on up the hill. There were two long trestles that had to be built to get the locomotives up to the Bothene Tunnel, and I realize now I have to take a picture next time you're driving up White's Hill, not far from the bottom. You'll see a sign on the left that says Bothene. It's a scout camp. Well, that's the railroad right away. So that led into that canyon, and that's where the west portal was, is right there. Now, this is the east portal in Woodacre. It's tunnel number 2 now. And she didn't climb up on the top. I don't know. Now, here you see a steam engine coming out of the tunnel, heading towards Point Reyes. And here's a view from the top of the tunnel, looking at one heading towards Sausalito. And somebody built a house on top of that one too. Now, the railroad, as traffic diminished, they wanted to abandon this line, but the authorities says, no, you have to keep running it. And the expense of operating a steam engine to take a very few passengers and a little freight out to Point Reyes Station cost too much. So this is a photograph, you can only see the front end of it. It's called a Bud car. It's gasoline-powered, self-propelled, and it has room for some passengers and it has room for some freight. So it was much more economical to run that between Fairfax and Point Reyes Station. Now, some of you may be familiar with Jim Staley, another local Marin historian. He lives in a house that's right next door to this tunnel. And he told me a number of years ago, he looked over where the tunnel was, and there was a tree that had been there for years, and it was gone. So he walked over, well, the tunnel had caved in, and the tree had gone down into it. So he climbed down there and came, so he may be the last person that was ever in that tunnel.
I went in that time.
Ah, okay. All right. So after the tracks were removed, the Marin Fire Department in Woodacre would use the tunnel as a shortcut to get to fires in central Marin. And there were a number of times when White's Hill Main Road was closed because of landslides, and the tunnel was also used for vehicle traffic. They had one of those stoplights at either end so people could get back and forth until the repairs were made. Well, one day the fire department went into the tunnel and there was no light at the other end. So they did do a little work to see about fixing it, but apparently the damage was so extensive that it wasn't worth repairing, and it's gone. So now this is the west portal, and you can see the light at the far end there. And this sign here says turn on headlights. And well, there's somebody with their headlights on in there. And a little Jeep comes out of there. And larger fire trucks, of course, they fit trains through there. It was easy for trucks. And now it's all caved in. Some of the timbers on the portal are still in place, though there's no tunnel there anymore. So that takes care of the narrow gauge. So now we're going to go to the standard gauge Tiburon line. And we're going to start with tunnel number 4, and I'm going to leave it tunnel number 4. Yes, it's the first one, so really it's tunnel 1, but it's tunnel 4. And this was built in 1879. Now, this railroad, Peter Donahue, his original western terminus was in Petaluma. So all of his freight and passengers would get on a ferry in Petaluma, and it took a while to get to San Francisco. So it was important for him to get closer. So he built from Petaluma to San Rafael. And this was the first tunnel that was required, like I said, 1879. There are lots of pictures of this tunnel. And Fred Cadoni I'm sure you've heard his name. He's been a guest speaker for this organization before. I've always said he's forgotten more about railroads than I will never learn. You know, he worked for the Northwestern Pacific Railroad and then stayed on the Southern Pacific. And this is the house he grew up in. So he's got quite a connection to the railroad. And this is another one of his many photographs. So the western portal has a faceted top on it. And here's a 1953, a diesel coming through. And the east portal has a rounded top on it. And it was used as a shortcut for years. You can see the footpath going towards it. This would be from the Terralinda side. Tragically, there was a fire in 1961. Some boys were in there playing with matches, and the creosote timbers, when they started burning, there was no stopping it. And it caused a tremendous amount of damage to the tunnel. Here's the east portal. You can see it's caved in right there. And on the west portal, the same thing. Tragically, there was a fireman in a truck above the tunnel when it caved in, and he was killed. And they petitioned to abandon the line because there wasn't that much railroad traffic in the mid-60s. The railroad authority says, nope, you got to fix it. So here's the repair crew. They put it back together, fixed the tunnel, and this was the first work train that went through the tunnel. And here is the first commercial load in September 27th, 1967. Now, I went out there with a couple of friends of mine. On the left, that's Jeff Kramer. Some of you probably know Jeff. He's a great historian, great supporter of local historical organizations. On the right, that's Alan Larkins. Jeff and Al and I were classmates at Greenbrae School and Kent School, and Jeff and I went to Redwood, and Al went to Marin Catholic. Now, when I took this picture, I was still using a camera that used film, and it was a bright day, and I had the speed set at 1,000th of a second. And as a result, it's one of the few photographs you'll ever see of Alan Larkins with his mouth closed. He's a talker. So anyway, there are gates at both ends, but you can easily get through them. So we walked through the tunnel. And there's a lot of water in that one also. And a lot of graffiti. And the graffiti stops where it gets dark, but the closer you are to the end, it's just covered with graffiti. Now, a number of years, we found that later on. So a number of years ago, they were widening Highway 101, and the railroad right-of-way had to be shifted, and Gelati did the job. And so here was some of their preliminary work where they set up some pumps to drain the water out of the tunnel. And this is one of Fred Cadoni's photographs. This is a freight train just having left San Rafael, getting ready to go into the tunnel. And Mike Peckner went and took a picture of the trains that are running there now. So SMART uses that same track. So there's the same portal there. And you can see the concrete ties and the ribbon rail for the SMART trains, and the graffiti people haven't got to it yet. So the rail line gets to San Rafael in 1879, but then what do the people do? They get off Peter Donahue's train, and they get on the North Pacific Coast to go to Sausalito. So Peter Donahue doesn't like that. So he has to extend the line to Tiburon. And that's quite a challenge. It required 3 tunnels, a lot of trestles, a drawbridge, and a lot of cutting and filling. So it was a very expensive section of track, but in the long run, it was well worth it. Now, they did have a ferry system operating in Tiburon, so they were able to build from both directions. So here you see tunnel number 1. There's the trestle, trestle Blackie's pasture just off to the left. And there's the train coming out of the tunnel and the house almost above that one. And here it is with the track still in place. And then the last train out of Tiburon with commerce load on it was in 1967. So after the tracks were removed, the land reverted back to the town of Tiburon, actually city of Tiburon at that time, and they were faced with deciding what to do with that tunnel. And it says here, Ellenwood concludes against including tunnel and trails. Well, Ellen Wood is Ann Ellen Wood. She was one of the early city council members in Tiburon. Something to do with the legal description of a town and a city is that they incorporated as a city, but they were actually a town, so they had to change it. So now they're the town of Tiburon. Now, this has nothing to do with tunnels. It's a May Day picture. In about 1923, it says B. Grant School in San Francisco. And the reason I put it in is that's Ann Ellenwood. There she is. And the reason I have this photograph is because that's my father. So my father's parents and the Ellenwood's parents, they were good friends. My dad was long gone when I got this photograph, so I sent a copy to his good friend Mike Rich. Now, Mike Rich raised his family here in Mill Valley. And there were some names written on the back that my grandmother had written, and Mike was able to identify some more. He did say he had no idea who this little blonde girl was that was holding the train of the May Queen, but he did identify the guy at the end as Martin Mackie. Now, Martin Mackie, you may know from the ecumenical housing here in Marin and all along the West Coast. Martin's daughter was a classmate of mine at Redwood High School. So when I got this photograph, I called her up and said, you got to see this photograph. So I sent her a copy, and she said, this is perfect timing that we're having a big family party for Martin's younger brother, Peter, who is turning 80. And she called me afterwards, and she said, that photograph is one of the hits of the whole party because the little blonde girl isn't a girl, it's a boy, and it's Peter Mackie. If you look closely, he's got the same sailor suit that his brother did. So he wasn't in the class, but I guess they just let him play May Day there. So anyway, Ann Ellen Wood had conferred with the rail officials, and it was going to be very expensive to stabilize the tunnel. And there are a lot of liability issues of having it. They couldn't use it. So having it part of a trail system was given up on. You climb up there now, and that's all that's left. It's the concrete portal that was put there in 1955. People have dug down to try to get in, but it's just full. There's nowhere to go. This is the west portal. The east portal is in somebody's backyard and is completely covered. Tunnel number 2 between Meadow Sweet and Tiburon, 1884. So this is the west portal on the Tiburon side. And this is the old family friend, Craig Lieber. He was there, I think it was about 1970, and he got his pickup truck up on the tracks. He said if you tried to drive, it fell right off. But they just did it for the picture. So there's a picture from inside the tunnel looking out. And that's all that's left of the west portal now. Water coming out of there all the time. And no surprise, well, there's the 1946 portal. They had a little problem in 1986. The tunnel caved in and made a big hole. And it started filling up with water until there was a lake there. And this was right in somebody's backyard. I mean, look, there's a fence that had drooped down there. So, yeah, that was a big deal. So it was privately owned property where the cave-in was, and the people that owned it really didn't want to spend the money to fix it, and they were trying to pin the responsibility on somebody else, and it took over a year to finally get a solution, and they filled it in. And this pipe you see in the foreground is still there, but it's completely overgrown now. And there were other cave-ins on that tunnel, actually when the railroad was still operating. So here is the east portal on the Corte Madera side. When they put that housing subdivision in that's just south of Highway 101, they completely reconfigured the land here, and that tunnel portal is way underground, never to be seen again. All right, last tunnel, number 3, Greenbrae. And this was originally built as a single-track tunnel. There was so much traffic going through it, it was worth the effort to have it widened to a double track. And a lot of traffic. Here's a passenger train coming through. Here's an electric train. And there were lots of freight trains that went through there as well. And now here, look at, here's Highway 101, 2 lanes in each direction and no traffic. There's the tunnel right down there. And this is the east portal with 2 tracks. East portal with 1 track in black and white and color, no tracks. And there's Alan and Jeff again. And Jeff took these photographs in about 1971 or 72. You can see the quarry is still operating, Billings and Hutchinson. And there were some old sidings that some people that owned some private rail cars were just using the sidings to store their equipment. Traffic continued on this line. As I said, the last train out of Sausalito was in 1971. And actually Handicap, the Wind Cup company, was one of the last customers for the railroad. They would have freight cars of plastic pellets brought in, and they had their own siding. So Jeff walked up to the tunnel, and it was in relatively good condition. Again, this is about 1970. I went back in about 2008, not so good, and it had been fenced off. There had been some fires and cave-ins, a lot of damage to that tunnel. Now, this is several slides out of a PowerPoint presentation that I got from Dave Bernardi, who had been the project manager for the restoration of this tunnel. So these are some of his slides here. I used that one to illustrate the kind of traffic that the tunnel had traditionally used. And this was the map. So you can see there's the tunnel, and this is the section that's going to be the passenger terminal for Smart Train. And this is where it goes down and where it crosses underneath Highway 101 and stops at Anderson Drive. Now, the estimated cost and the estimated completion, actually, they're very close on both. And this is one of their photos of the east portal. And later on, when it was just sealed up. And now they're opening the gates and getting ready to start work. They found there was a cave-in just inside the tunnel, and it doesn't show clearly in this photograph, but just beyond that, there was some temporary bracing that had been put in on an earlier days when something was getting ready to cave in. Well, what they did at this end, most of the redwood timbers were still there, not in great condition though, and this was the hole in the top of the tunnel that had created that pile of dirt we saw on the earlier slide. He said it was big enough you could have driven a car into it. But what they did there is they cleared out the tunnel, they put new footings on the side with steel, vertical steels, and they brought these arched pieces in, and they lifted the arches up and landed them on the vertical pieces, and they worked into the tunnel that direction. So stabilizing the tunnel from the inside. They did take all the old timbers out. Some guy bought all these old timbers, cleaned them up and cut them up, and was making patio furniture and selling them as wood. It's all beautiful old growth redwood. And I guess all the little pieces were used as well. So this is the west portal. There were 2 cave-ins here, and this was solved in a completely different manner. What they did here, see, there's the cave-in that we just saw right at the portal. And then there was another one a little further back. So they dug everything out, all the way up to sky. And they put in the same steel braces, and they covered it with what's called stay-form, and covered it with concrete from the top. And filled it back in. So there's the second cave-in. They did the same process there. And this was the architectural drawing. The area on the right is where the trains will run. The area on the left is the multi-use path for bicycles, pedestrians, etc. This was their cross section. Here you see, no, I'm going too fast here. Yeah, this is for people over here, and this is for trains. Now, notice the car is tilting. Well, it isn't going to tilt when it goes through there, but they have what they call the dynamic envelope, is that when a train goes through there, it's going to rock back and forth a little bit. So they have to make sure to leave enough clearance that it isn't going to have any problems. So now I'm back to my pictures again. Here they're through with all the structural work, and they're starting on the path and the wall between the 2 sides. And this is over on the east portal. A lot of work going on, rain or shine. They really went at this project. And I was fortunate enough to be able to arrange a tour of the tunnel while it was under construction. So we got to go in before it was finished. And there's Dave Bernardi right there. He was the project manager. So he led us on this tour. And you can see the roof isn't done and the walls aren't done, but temporary lighting. And, well, there's Fred Cadoni. There he is. And then there's Brian Sagar, both really helpful in this program. And we took this group shot of all the train nuts there. That's Dave Bernardi over there on the left. Now, Brian used his skills with Photoshop to take us into the future. BNSF in San Rafael? Now, just so you all know, there will be no freight trains coming into San Rafael. It can't be done because the smart cars are built to light rail configurations. They are narrower than freight cars. And all of the stations are built so when the train comes in, they open the doors and you walk right in and out. A freight train cannot go past a passenger loading platform. So all of the stations north of Highway 37 have what's called a gantlet track. So it's like a siding. So the freight train will come up to the terminal, go out on the side track, go around and come back in again. There aren't any south of 37, so you don't have to worry about freight trains in San Rafael anytime soon anyway. Here the project's done. We were just out there poking around. That's Craig Lieber. That's the guy that had the pickup truck by the tunnel at the other place. And notice they put another emblem of 2010 showing the updated work on the tunnel. Now, they did have a grand opening. Big crowd of people came, December 10th, 2010. And so there's Dave Bernardi, smile on his face. He's glad that project's behind him. So the politicians did their politicking, and they put the red ribbon across, and the big scissors, and it's done. And they let them go. So the first day, they only allowed pedestrians through the tunnel. Day 2 was open to pedestrians and bicycles. I walked through it again when the crowd had thinned out a little bit. And really, if you haven't been through it, it's surprisingly nice. Well lighted, got big fans, it's well ventilated. And that's Fred Runner. He's been a speaker here a couple of times. There's a bunch of rules you got to follow. They close it up so there's not going to be people sleeping in there at nighttime. But the bike, okay, on the right is where the tracks will go. And apparently the contract has been signed and likely that the trains will be able to run out there as soon as 2019 to get to the Larkspur Landing stop. Now the bike path runs along behind the back of Rafael Lumber. And so I zoomed in on the gate there. There's my friend Al Larkins. No doubt jabbering away with whoever's in the truck. So when things cleared out, I called him up on his cell phone. I said, "Hey, Al, I'm up here on the railroad right away." And he waved at me with a sign of good friendship. That's what a friend's for. So Fred and I walked, and this is the path under Highway 101 for pedestrians, and the old wood trestle is still there. That will be upgraded to whatever specifications smart engineers require. And the path runs down to Anderson Drive, and it's there for use right now, and that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Do we have questions? And Richard, if you could repeat the question before answering it. Be great.
Okay.
Thanks, Deborah. I was at a meeting maybe a year ago about the possibility of reopening the Alto Tunnel. It was held in the community center. And there was a lot of discussion as to who is responsible for what, because some of the homeowners on top have houses on top of the tunnel, said that they own the property that goes all the way down, and they don't want to be responsible if there's any damage when it's opened. Others said, no, it's the county. Do you have any answers about that?
I don't personally, but I'm not going to repeat that question because everybody heard it. There's a lady in the audience, Lee, is she still here? Lee is here, who is involved with that project, and she just told me before I started that they did some research on the right-of-way, very detailed research on who owns what, and apparently it is clear, and they will be able to use the right-of-way. They've done some recent research by boring down into the tunnel from above, and they have some kind of laser measuring equipment, so they've been surveying the tunnel from the outside, and then they're in the process of determining what the costs are going to be. And it's one of those things that's going to have costs for the tunnel and then improvements on both ends, so it's kind of open-ended. But I think if you talk to Lee, she's going to be able to. Lee, could you stand up a second? So if you've got Alto questions, there's your answer. Unless they're before 1957 or something.
Well, I think a great train tunnel story to find documentation and pictures on is in the 1970s after the San Rafael Tunnel closed. One morning there was a call, and there were 4 concrete trucks stuck in the tunnel. And somebody who worked for Shamrock had been on a little bit of adventure with liquid enhancement, and had gotten and got one truck stuck in there, and then he went back and got another truck to get that one stuck, and they found him in the morning at 7 a.m. with the 4 trucks in the tunnel, and he was asleep in there. So I think that would make a great slideshow if you could find the IJ to find those slides.
Well, I don't have to answer that question. Thank you. That's a great story.
I was just curious, in 1870, if you're building a tunnel, what kind of construction equipment do you have, and how long does it take to build 1,000 feet through the rock?
Well, the length of time to build the tunnel, of course, is determined by how hard the rock is. One of the slides that Fred Codoni had indicated that they were using black powder. So that's going to be a time-consuming technique. And it's got to be the length of, the hardness of the rock that's going to determine. I don't think there isn't a set time of how long it takes. But it would have been hard work, a lot of manual labor, and be easier to do it with the equipment they have today.
Question back here. You're obviously very involved in railroads. I found it curious that you spoke as if it was a positive that there would be no freight trains south of Ignacio. Why is that?
I wouldn't say that's necessarily my personal opinion, though I have seen some editorials in the newspaper, people fearful that freight trains were going to be rumbling through San Rafael all times of the day. Well, they're not going to be. The type of traffic that would be generated in today's economic environment, I don't know that there would be a value for the railroad to be bringing freight into San Rafael. Who are they going to bring stuff to? During the building boom in the 50s and 60s, Fred Codoni was saying that there would be 70 or 80 freight trains bringing building material and gravel every day. And that was during a building boom. And I don't think that there is enough economic reason to bring freight trains in at this point.
Actually, I was involved in that question, and I can say there is an economic reason from Marin Sanitary, where they collect all the garbage, and they need to transport it to the north. So that's something that could have been done easily, but wasn't.
Yeah, well, the decision to make the cars light rail was contentious, and there were a number of people from the railroad end of it who didn't want the light rail configuration because they knew it would block the freight trains. Had it been done the other way, freight would have been an easier option than it is now. The Gantlet tracks are in the neighborhood of $1 million a piece, and I would be surprised if there wasn't opposition. I would support it. I don't mean to give the impression that I don't, but I believe there would be opposition to freight train coming in. Though I think the garbage aspect would be a good selling point. I'll vote for it.
I have heard that the so-called 5-minute tunnel in the Marin Headlands was also a railroad tunnel for, I guess, ordnance for the Army or something. Do you know anything about that?
I have never heard that it was used for rail traffic. So I don't know the answer to that question. I know that they took that, 120-foot gun up to Battery Townsley through that tunnel when the original one was delivered before World War II, and the second one that's up there now took the same route.
Okay.
What was the last year that passengers were carried out of Mill Valley and Tiburon by train?
Tiburon, I can't tell you the exact date, but when the Northwestern Pacific Railroad consolidated, I think it was 5 or 6 smaller railroads in Northern California, they discontinued passenger traffic to Tiburon, and all passenger traffic went to Sausalito. So that consolidation was in 1907. So I would say that passenger traffic to Tiburon would have ended around that time. The last passenger train from San Rafael to Eureka, I believe, was in 1958. The electric system stopped operating on February 28, 1941, but the passenger trains from San Rafael to Eureka continued till late 50s.
Richard?
Yes.
Can you be more specific about where the Meadow Sweet Tunnel was, the second one in Tiburon?
Well, the east portal, I showed you some pictures of it, and I could show you easily on a map exactly where it is. You drive up into a neighborhood, and there's a little path that goes down. I'm sorry, the west portal on the Tiburon side, you can find the east portal is completely buried. Now, you can find the old railroad right-of-way closer to Corte Madera. You can still see where the tracks were, and you can extrapolate where, it headed towards the hill. Tiburon would be the west portal, and it's in an. There used to be a school, a public school that was later converted into a Jewish synagogue, and it's in that. I can't think of that. It's in that neighborhood there. Blackfield, yeah, that's the area. Yes. Yes.
Were there ever any issues with the third rail, the ground level third rail that was running all over the place in southern Marin?
Absolutely, yes.
I would have thought.
Lots of problems with that. They had to put fences around the entire system because wild animals and domestic animals would stray onto the track, and there are more than a few incidents of cars running into the third rail, or a car would be in the crossing, the train would hit it, push the car into the third rail, 600 volts. So, yeah, people were killed and people were maimed, lost arms, lost legs, and then there were people who were frivolous about it. I heard the story of a guy who had really long hair, and he would bet people that he could do a handstand on the third rail. And so he'd coil his hair up in the top of his head. I guess he was acrobatically skilled enough, he'd bend over and put his head in and stand up, just balance on his head, and win his bet.
You talked about, you showed pictures of how the bike path went north of the park, to the tunnel between San Rafael and Greenbrae. But this is just a comment for those who aren't aware. As you come out on the south end in Larkspur, you can go down to right where the movie theaters are, and then that new bridge over Sir Francis Drake Boulevard is so that bicyclists can get directly to the ferry. Just a little bit of information for people who wanted to know what happened at this end of the tunnel.
I like the Dirty Harry Bridge better.
One more question. Do we have any more questions?
Where is the Alto Tunnel?
Alto Tunnel.
Sorry.
That's the one between Mill Valley and Corte Madera. So, you know where the bike path goes behind where the Mill Valley Post Office is? That goes that direction, and that's where it goes into the hill on the Mill Valley side. And on the other side is called Chapman Park. There's a street called Tunnel Lane, and Tunnel Lane is near the end of the tunnel. Like I said, you can see the east portal. You can get in there. Wear boots. It's wet. But the west portal is so overgrown that it isn't easily accessible at this point.
Okay, I think that's it then. Thank you
All right.
very, very much. Next month, we have Chuck Oldenburg talking about Tamalpais Camp. We'll see you then. Thanks so much, and thanks for your help tonight, too. Good night.